Hello, thank you for listening to the content on decision-making standards and procedures. The following presentation will discuss risk analysis, specifically risk analysis and project management. At the end of the lesson, you should be able to define risk analysis, identify potential risks, recognize and deal with risks when they occur, and know how to read and complete a risk assessment form. In nonprofits, risks range from misuse of funds to volunteer liability. Risk analysis is essential in nonprofits and can prevent and mitigate adverse events. At the end of this presentation, you should be able to define risk analysis, identify potential risks, recognize risks and know how to deal with them, and read risk assessment forms. Risk analysis is defined as a systematic process of identifying, analyzing, and resolving the project's risk issues, including maximizing the probabilities and consequences of positive events and minimizing the probability and consequences of adverse events against project objectives. In the following video, Jennifer Bridges explains risk analysis and why it is important.
Today we're talking about risk analysis, how to analyze risk on your projects. But before we start, I want to stop and take a look at the word analyze, because so many times I hear people interchanging different words like risk identification, risk management, risk analysis. They're three different words, three different things. So the whiteboard session today, we're going to talk about the analysis. And when we analyze the risk, we're examining methodically in detail. And why would we want to do this? Well, there are several really big reasons why. First of all, we're trying to avoid any potential litigations, address maybe any regulatory issues, or comply with new legislation. Ultimately, we're trying to reduce our exposure and minimize the impact of any risk. So what are some insights that we've had in working with so many projects? Well, first of all, we found that there's no lack of information out there about risk. But what happens is sometimes much of the information is very complex and can be quite intimidating. Most industries have their own best practices, and many companies have their own framework. And we found that the risk analysis can be done to extremes. On some projects, it's not done at all because they feel like they don't have any risk. And then on some projects, it's done to the nth degree. I mean, think about it. If we're sending a rocket to the moon with astronauts, we want to protect those people. So let's look at where and when the risk analysis is done. Well, if we look at the project management process groups, the planning process is where we start looking at the risk, and it's done throughout the entire project. So we develop our risk management plan and identify the risks, and those are captured in our risk register. So as a reminder, the register identifies all the risks, the impacts, the risk response, and the risk level. We're ultimately looking at what the potential impacts to the activity resource estimates, the activity duration estimates, possibly the schedule, the cost estimates, budgets and quality, and even the procurements. So when we take the risk register, then we take those items, and that's where we do the detail analysis. And we do that in two parts. The first part, we perform a qualitative risk analysis. And there, what we're doing is that's a process of prioritizing the risk for further analysis or action, depending upon the probability and the impact of those risks. The benefits of that is it helps to reduce the level of uncertainty of those risks on the project and allows us to focus on the high priority risk. The second piece is performing the quantitative risk analysis. And what that is, it's a process for numerically analyzing the effect of those risks on the project. The benefit of that is it helps support in decision making to reduce the project uncertainty. And again, that can help us, number one, plan the risk responses and control those risks. So those are some great reasons why, and a few tips on how to analyze the risk on your projects.
The following chart shows the risk analysis process. It is important to establish the context of the risk and where it fits in within the project. As you can see by the graph, Risk analysis is something that is continuously happening throughout a project or within an agency. It starts with identifying a risk and determining its severity and the likelihood of it happening. If the risk is misuse of funds, it is a severe risk that needs to be dealt with as soon as possible. After determining the severity of the risk, it is important to manage the risk. If there is a misuse of funds, it's important to determine who is doing it, how much it is, and what the action steps are. When it is all said and done, it is important to monitor and review. This step is important as it could possibly prevent the same thing from happening again. As we see at the end of the cycle, the risk analysis process is something that is continuous. Keeping the process going mitigates risk as much as possible. There are many types of risk. Among them are technological, insurance-related, environmental safety, regulatory, and financial. An example of a technological risk can be a breach of the data in an organization's network. An insurance-related risk could be a volunteer getting hurt while volunteering for the organization. An environmental safety risk could be occupational hazards, such as slipping and falling while working. An example of a regulatory risk could be using funds for financial or political gain. In the next slide, we will go in depth on financial risks. Nonprofits face any number of major and minor financial risks. The next slide will explain some of the financial risks involved in project management. When it comes to nonprofits, financial risks can be among the most important. Financial risks can include investments, fraud, misuse of funds, tax liabilities, tax-exempt status, fundraising, and physical assets. Zweikel and Ahn suggest that risk analysis is important because projects usually possess high levels of uncertainty derived from their compressed schedules, inadequate or uncertain budgets, designs that are near the feasible limit of achievable performance, and frequently changing requirements. Risk analysis can identify potential risks and prevent them from happening, or deal with them before they have serious effects. Risk analysis can also prevent future risks from happening after they happen once. Policies developed after a risk happens can prevent the risk from happening again. The risk management process involves continuous risk identification, risk evaluation, risk mitigation and contingency measure definition, risk monitoring and control, and risk identification efficiency measurement. To help do this, there are a number of tools and techniques to help identify risks. The following slide will discuss some of those tools and techniques. There are several tools and techniques that can be used to identify risks. One of them is brainstorming, which is done with a group of people who focus on the identification of risk for the project. The Delphi technique is when a team of experts have been consulted anonymously. A list of required information is sent to experts, responses are compiled, and results are sent back for further review until a consensus is reached. Interviewing is when interviews are conducted with project participants, stakeholders, and experts to identify risks. Root cause analysis is a systematic process used to identify the fundamental risks that are embedded in a project. This usually occurs after a problem has developed and aims to find the causes. A SWOT analysis stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. SWOT allows for analysis and cross-reference by looking at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Finally, assumption analysis identifies different assumptions of the project and determines their validity. This further helps in identifying risks for the project. In the next 3 slides, we will look at 3 different risk assessments. After risks are identified, matrices are often used to assess the risk. This slide shows an example of a risk matrix. The risk matrix is an effective tool that assists in risk evaluation by considering the probability or likelihood against severity linked with the potential risks of a project. A risk matrix is a visual representation of the risks involved in a particular project to help in preparing a mitigation plan and decision-making. In short, it is a tool that assists in reducing the risk impact that might cost business adversely otherwise. The next example is an impact classification matrix. The score represents bottom thresholds for the classification of risks, assuming normal conditions. An upgrade of the score to the next or even next +1 level is necessary if the risk is impacted by critical factors such as how important the specific stakeholder is, whether the project is critical for the further development of the relationship with the stakeholder, the risk is already in the focus of the stakeholder, specific penalties for deviations from project targets are agreed in the contract with the stakeholder. The last risk assessment example is a checklist. This is fairly straightforward. In the example, we see 3 options: yes, no, and not available. While other examples focused on severity of risks, the simplicity of the checklist shows risks as black and white. If no is answered for something like "are exits clearly marked?", you have the answer right there. In nonprofits, this can be helpful, especially if you need to stay up to code to avoid environmental safety risks. In conclusion, risk analysis is incredibly important in project management. It can prevent adverse events and can mitigate them if they occur. Risk analysis is a systematic process of identifying, analyzing, and resolving a project's risk issues. Risk analysis is something that begins before a project and happens all the way until it is finished. Risk assessments are often used to predict, identify, and mitigate risks and identify adverse effects in a project. Can prevent or mitigate adverse events in a project. Thank you for participating. I hope you have a better understanding of risk analysis. Next, you will learn about post-project evaluations, another important component of project management. Before you move on, minimize this video and click on the button at the right corner of the web page labeled Quiz to proceed and test your knowledge on risk analysis.